Russia is pulling out all the stops to keep its war machine equipped, but more and more leaked footage from behind Russian lines is coming out, revealing the true state of the Russian equipment shortage. We're going to break down just what this means for the Russian military. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into it. Okay, so this is kind of a follow-up to my earlier video where I discussed that the analysis and statistics, or at least the estimates by a lot of analysts, say that Russia in the next 12 to 18 months, if it sustains its current loss rate, may actually run out of armored vehicles entirely. And armored vehicles, as you guys know, are essential to the current Russian strategy, relying on light infantry assaults supported by armor in absolutely massive quantities, hoping to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses. And while that strategy has allowed Russia to make battlefield gains, again, not quickly and not really operationally significant ones, it has put the Ukrainians on the back foot. But just how much longer can Russia sustain this? We're seeing more and more evidence that, well, that may not be the case. Here, for example, is a train of Russian T62s on their way to the front line of Ukraine. Now, what I want to point out is a couple of interesting details here. First off, that this actually corroborates reports that we've heard earlier from Ukrainian aligned partisans. And so I suspect that this person filming this may actually be one of those Ukrainian aligned partisans. And as an aside, I always point this out. People, a lot of times the LARP crowd, especially in the United States, has this fantasy of like, I'm going to be a stealthy saboteur, solid snake in my sneaking suit. Like that's the kind of partisan I would be. My brother in Christ, this is a partisan. As you can see, this looks like could even be a female, an older male, right? The most generic, normie-looking person who just happens to, hang out around the train tracks, maybe a little bit longer than they otherwise would have to, and thinks it's interesting, when they see column of tanks rushing by, Maybe this video ends up in the hands of Ukrainians. Maybe they know exactly where this military train is going to be. And if they know the time and place and direction of the train, well, the Ukrainians can learn a lot from that. And if the depot where the train is headed gets hit, that's no fault of this partisan. So again, the partisan's favorite weapon is a cell phone and a real good memory and a watch. But you can see here, they're revealing that we know these T-62s are headed to the Ukrainian front line because you can see they've had cope cages installed. These cages are meant to provide at least the gunner a level of protection against dropped munitions, right? That iconically kind of Ukrainians would drop into the turret hatch, causing the rounds to cook off inside, right? Once the mortar goes off, and in turn exploding the entire tank. Exploiting, again, T62, so that means that it was designed 60-odd years ago. So, again, you're talking about a 60-year-old design, a 60-year-old Soviet design, and so that should tell you how these things can or cannot compete on the modern battlefield. But, as you can see, quantity is a quality all its own. You might know that a lot of European countries really went to the news saying that they were giving literally 14, 12 modern main battle tanks. But you can see there's 12 tanks in this thing here. You're looking at easily 12 to 14 T62 tanks, likely these other carriages, possibly containing things like spare parts or munitions. Again, but you could see that quantity has a quality all its own. And all of these, again, they've had the cages installed. They have the barrels covered. They look like they are really prepared for transport and likely are fully operational. Now, this is, again, something that, while dated, is a absolutely massive quantity. And you ask yourself, how many of these T62s can go toe-to-toe with a single Leopard or an Abrams? And the answer is not that clear. But the takeaway is again that Russia is pulling out old stock. Again, 60-year-old main battle tanks. This is the equivalent of the United States using a Vietnam era main battle tank in a modern war. Again, I'm not going to sit there and be like, it's irrelevant, it can't do anything. It can do many things, right? It can absorb small arms fire. It can indeed engage trench positions at a distance of, a few hundred meters with adequate accuracy. So I'm not going to sit there and be like, these tanks don't have a battlefield role, but obviously the T72s, T80s, T90s are superior in basically every single way. And the fact that the Russian analysts at the Kremlin sat there, they crunched the numbers, and they said, listen, building a fresh T72 is not worth it. It is better for us to devote resources to refurbishing T62s and getting them to the battlefield in whatever state they're in. That alone, the fact that the fact they're doing this, right? Imagine if the U.S. Army said, listen, we need to build more Abrams. They said, or, hear me out, we can't build any more Abrams. We have to go deep into old stockpiles, unseal some vaults, and take out 70-year-old tanks and get them rolling again and send them to the battlefield. That alone should tell you the state of the Russian logistics system and the state of Russia's ability to conduct manufacturing of sophisticated military gear. And again, T-72 is not that sophisticated, but much more so, right, than a T-62. And it should tell you, again, the fact that these sanctions are really prohibiting Russia from getting the supplies it needs to manufacture the tanks, and manufacturing within Russia doesn't really have the capability to produce new ones. And that, again, it's worth it for them. Remember, for every one of these tanks that we saw roll, I think there's a pretty good chance that back at the depot or the storage area, there's likely another T-62 whose parts, or T-72, excuse me. No, yeah, T-62, whose parts were cannibalized, who already were missing parts or had damage that made it unable to roll, and that a mechanic likely pulled parts out of that and installed them in these trucks these tanks to get them battlefield ready. So again, we're seeing a Russia that's looking pretty desperate. But here's some more. As you can see, here are some very old Soviet-style sedans that also appear to have been re-equipped and are ready for frontline service, right? Or at least not frontline service, nearly frontline service. We've seen more and more of these kind of like second-line vehicles operating. And don't get me wrong, the Ukrainians also rely on civilian vehicles, but they are generally not looking like this. Observe, make some notes here. One, they have this fencing in the front, likely to to offer some kind of rudimentary protection against kamikaze drones. You also notice, though, this protection is kind of moot because these doors have been removed. There's no doors on these vehicles. In fact, if you look carefully, it does not appear that there are windshields on these doors. You notice the bumpers are destroyed. Notice, obviously, these are all different models, some of which are missing parts. So you look at this, and this is not indicative. These are clearly military vehicles, right? They're camouflaged. They're all painted in OD green. All of that tells you, yeah, these are vehicles meant for combat, but they are so far from operational. And again, are they going to be on the front lines? Well, we've seen golf carts on the front lines, so the answer is maybe. But more likely they're going to be functioning as like behind-the-line vehicles. And generally, while we've seen Ukrainian vehicles that have taken a beating, certainly, they're almost always in more modern vehicles, right? Things manufactured in the last 2 decades. These look like they've been manufactured, again, 40 to 50 years ago, and likely in the Soviet Union. So when you look at that, again, that should also be what we call a clue that the Russian military may not quite be sporting what it needs. Now, I've got one more video to show you, and then a really interesting chart. This is Ukrainian soldiers pointing out some of the weapons acquired as trophies from Russian soldiers. Now, YouTube, listen, they're just pointing to weapons lying on a bed. That's it. There's no Nothing bad. Please don't demonetize me. Okay. So, what are some things we can observe about this? First off, this looks like a very, very dated weapon. All of them, at least these two in particular, look like about T72, AK-74s used in the Soviet-Afghan War. This kind of magazine is sort of iconic to the 74. Right? He points out here there's another AK style weapon. Again, it looks like a 74. It might be a 101, but look at how old this looks. Look at this, the old school Bakelite handle. This is rusted and corroded. These are just barely serviceable weapons. And he's going to point out that this weapon up top here is the Ukrainian weapon. Right? So again, just look at the condition here of this weapon. It's just awful. And Bakelite, I want to point out, is a plastic alternative, again, used during the Soviet Union era. It's more brittle. It degrades easier. It's just modern polymers are just superior in every single way. Again, this is a metal magazine, and you can literally see it's deeply, deeply rusted. But then look at that. This is the other thing. This is reflection of a level of just like total apathy and total lack of training. It's to get the rounds in this position, they're all kind of oriented correctly, but it almost looks like, again, the weapon was so poorly maintained that it looks like almost as it fed the rounds in. The rounds were either so old, or the magazine was so old, or the rifle was so old that it somehow fed, shoving the rounds like back into the magazine. And then it looks like the soldier, being incredibly poorly trained, simply tried to repeat the mistake again and again, creating this kind of jammed up situation. It's also possible that the person loading the magazine may have also just fucked up and just loaded them all screwed up. I mean, this is, it's hard for me to even conceive how you can screw up an AK style magazine like this. I also would observe, I can't see the rounds, but it looks like it's even possible these may not even be the right rounds, right? I'll show you what I'm talking about real quick. When we look at 545 versus 762. 762 by 39. Let's see if we can find this in images. Yeah, so observe this here. This is the, so this round, let's, here we go. Want a nice big, yeah, here we go. Here's a good example, right? So on the left, you have a 762 by 39. This is the old school AK47 cartridge and AKM. On the right, you have the 545 by 39. And you can see this one looks a lot more like the United States 556 round. And it's not by accident. It's lighter. It has a little bit shorter range, but it's way more lethal with that smaller bullet. And again, I think kind of based on these pictures, I think it's actually possible. Let's see if we can ramp it up. I think it's actually possible. Just these look really thick. These might not even be the right rounds, which is absolutely insane. He's saying some of these guys have no will to fight. And he's I mean, listen, if you were handed a weapon like this, if you were handed a weapon like this and you were going to go in the battle, it was going to potentially protect you and defend your life, would you at least clean it? Like, this doesn't look like anybody cleaned it. And it looks like this got soaked. Then they gave you these rounds, and it's not clear these Russians know how to load the weapon, or that the weapon may not be able to function, or that they may not have even been given rounds that work. So all of those things really, you're forced to conclude that the Russians were, I mean, these guys are just rolling out into battle with some of the worst gear. I'm literally fluxumed. I don't know what else to tell you. This is like, and I understand that in this war, right? Getting close enough to even use your weapon against the enemy is kind of like a victory for the Russians at baseline, given the fact that many of their attacks are broken up or destroyed before they ever get into small arms range. But if you're going to do all that effort and then you're going to give your meat wave, not going to give them weapons that they can fight with, you're going to have a bad time. And again, the fact that Russia is still making progress with this absolutely terrible gear is a sign of just how often they are just surging, pushing troop after troop after troop into the Ukrainian positions until basically zombie horde style they have to withdraw. Anyway, guys, if you feel like you can't get it done in a given day, you don't have to rely on meat wave assaults. Instead, maybe you just need a little extra caffeine. Strike Gum is the answer. It's got zero sugar, unlike a lot of these energy drinks that have 40 grams plus. It has 90 milligrams of caffeine and 100 milligrams of alpha GPC in every single piece. This bad boy packs all the caffeine of a Red Bull or an Amp Energy. So if you're looking for a caffeine or a energy drink really alternative that isn't $5 a pop, then Strike Gum's the way to go. You can go to strikegum.com. That's where you got your veteran discounts, your new user discounts, all of it. But if you are an Amazon person, you can go to Amazon, just search for Strike Gum or click the link in the description and pick some up. Strike Gum is the superior energy drink alternative. It's made in the USA, veteran-owned, uses natural caffeine, none of the dehydrated lab encapsulated stuff. So check it out, strikegum.com. Okay, so here's a chart that I thought was really interesting. And what this chart depicts, let's pull it up here. These are Russian tank losses from the midpoint of a 3-month average by type, data from warspotting.net. So they take, basically they're looking at the average every quarter of tank losses. And you can see it's color-coded, but it also is helpful because it goes top to bottom. The bottom is the oldest tanks, T62s. Then you've got green T64s, orange T72s, blues or T80s, and the greens on top T90s. Okay, so best tank to worst tank, or rather newest tank to oldest tank. And you can see that when the war started, it was very clear that the Russian forces were relying primarily on T72s and T80s, right? That's almost all the Ukrainians took out. Now remember, there's a little bit of a bias because these are tanks destroyed. So the Russians are going to preserve their best tanks for their most winnable battles. And they're also, older tanks are more likely to be destroyed. So it's going to skew a little bit older. But as we point out here, you can see that over the course of the war, right, Russia started reaching into its old stock pretty heavily around November. Right, likely as part of an effort probably to replenish its initial tank losses that it incurred during that initial battle of Kiev, right? You saw they rolled out a bunch of T62s. It's also possible that this was part of equipping the DPR and LPR with their own. Generally, they received way lower quality weapon systems, and so it's possible that they were in the fight and simply incurred a lot of casualties. But then you can see in January, right, there was that strategic pivot, January 23 of last year, and Russian tank losses all seem to generally decrease, right? You're seeing a kind of return to that modern tank focus. Minimal losses from T90s, losses primarily made up of T72s and T80s, and that was basically the case all the way until December of this year. And then in December of this year, something interesting started to happen. You started to see more and more T62s come on to the battlefield. Really bizarre stuff, right? You see here, they made up 5.4% of the loss of tank losses. That's 1 in 20 tanks in December of 23. But then it only increased. Now, in July, T62s, again, the oldest tanks in the entire arsenal, made up almost a quarter of Russia's tank losses. Comparatively, you're seeing, again, fewer, almost an annual low of T90 losses, and the T90s have never made up a really substantial portion of the Russian military effort. You can see here, right, that, at most they were the most you saw is about 10% of them in September 23, likely as part of the Battle of Avdiivka. We heard about that, where Russia gathered a whole ton of its best armored forces in an effort to try to conduct that encirclement, and they failed. But you can see the T-90 losses remained very high and have only now started to reduce. Again, possibly because they're literally running out of T-90s. They took more losses than they can sustain. And that seems to be the pattern that they've been under. Russia builds a few new T-90s up here, and then they lose all their T-90s, and they can't field them anymore. And they build more, and then they field all their T-90s and lose them all, and then they can't build them again. But you see, there's no sustainment of effort. And you can see here T-72s, or T-80s, excuse me, becoming way less capable. And then T-72s, again, making up the majority of the losses. But man, this chart here is the number one indicator that Russia is reaching deep into its old stock. And this number, you can see it's starting to exponentially increase. It hasn't gone down a single quarter, since February, right? So you're seeing this steady increase of the percentage of Russian tank losses that are shouldered by their oldest, most out-of-date tanks. That alone is a sign that I think Russia is reaching deep into its stocks. It's really starting to feel the crunch of sanctions, particularly against high-level, more sophisticated military equipment. Again, more ceramic armors, thermal optics, all the sort of high-tech stuff you need to make a modern main battle tank really pop. Instead, therefore, they've said, hey, listen, it's actually cheaper for us to just build parts for T-62s. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thanks to Bill Collier, Robin Colburn, Gaius Marning, Eugenia Cuesta, Chris Gorsuch, and Fran Zacharias. The Colonel tiers, as well as the Lieutenant tiers, could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you all so much, and I will catch you in the next one. Cheers.